Okay. Thank you. Good morning from Toronto. The presentation that I'm giving today is the results of a collaborative effort between myself and two senior colleagues here at the University of Toronto, Professors Peter Donnelly and Bruce Kidd, also with significant efforts from three of the graduate students in our program here in kinesiology and physical education. The purpose of this project that I'm presenting today was to examine the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically within Commonwealth countries, and looking particularly at community sport and sport for development. And this is a project that was commissioned and funded and very generously supported by the Social Policy Development section of the Commonwealth Secretariat. So I'd like to acknowledge their support for this. What we did in this project over the last 2 or 3 months was to conduct extensive review of literature from Commonwealth and other publicly available websites. We also reviewed program documents from 7 sport for development agencies spread across 13 Commonwealth countries. And we supplemented this with interviews with 8 academic and professional colleagues with expertise in community sport and sport for development across the Commonwealth. In general, I think it's important to lay out some contextual factors which applied to many of the situations in countries that came up in this study, and these are similar to what other colleagues have already spoken about today. But in general, these contextual factors we found across the landscape. The first was that we found that few countries were prepared for the pandemic, especially in the areas of community sport and sport for development. And related to this, and as a result, participation in sport and physical activity fell significantly as a result of the pandemic, with a likely impact, in some cases perhaps a severe impact, on mental health and general well-being. On a more positive note, we've also found that many sport organizations, including their athletes, responded with immediate cooperation in response to the pandemic and the challenges that it presented. And similarly, that many local governments and sport organizations across the Commonwealth clearly and quickly developed innovative approaches to the changed circumstances that the virus presented and necessitated. So I'll speak a little bit more then about the specific report and the findings that are in the report, and I have the link to the full report, which can be accessed publicly and online. I'll provide that at the end of the presentation. But our findings fell into 5 areas: prevention measures, mobilizing community sport in response to the pandemic, establishing guidelines for return to activity, program modifications, and then last but certainly not least, the possibilities for building back better. Given the time constraints today, I'm not going to go into each of these 5 areas of findings, but again, you can read them in the report. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about number 1 and number 5, because I think these are perhaps the most significant and the most informative about the current landscape. So the first of our major findings sections is an assessment of the prevention measures that were taken within community sport in response to the pandemic. It became very clear to us through this research project that national and local policies were often applied to community sport across the Commonwealth, and that in most cases this led to a complete cessation of sports. National and local policies were also, to prevent the spread of COVID-19, were also, and in turn, enforced by the closure of sports facilities, the closure of public recreation spaces, and the closure of and shutdown of recreational physical activity. This happened across the Commonwealth. At the same time, some facilities that were closed for community sport were very quickly repurposed for other community needs. So from this, and this is one of the goals of this project in general, from this we've gleaned in this case, two recommendations for policymakers and for governments. One is to suggest that when repurposing sports facilities, it's important to involve both local and national governments, and also to involve the owners and managers of sports facilities in negotiating how to repurpose facilities. So there is this possibility for repurposing, but it needs to be done through consultation. And then we also were recommending the compilation and availability of best practices, including the ways in which adaptations have been made to online sources, that these techniques be shared as widely as possible. So I'll jump ahead then to the fifth of our five major areas of findings, and this was around sport and social inequality. And what we found in this area was that the pandemic very clearly exposed the underfunding and in some cases the neglect of physical education and community sport in various Commonwealth countries. And in particular, the pandemic exacerbated the already lower participation of marginalized groups, including but certainly not limited to girls and women. So from this, we've suggested that that the pandemic presents the possibility for building back better when it comes to sport and physical activity and community sport and sport for development. And we've suggested three key areas of this: funding, online programming, and urban design. So for example, in funding, that we can now ask ourselves questions about whether returning to the status quo funding is going to be enough, or whether we have an opportunity here for funding that would lead to better sport. Similarly for online programming. And then one of the things that really stood out in our research was that some significant innovations have been implemented when it comes to urban design in response to the pandemic, and we now have an opportunity in the fields of community sport and sport for development to think about ways to make those innovations much more long-lasting, so that their positive impacts can be felt for years to come. So I've pulled out one quotation from our report here, that the overarching theme, one of the overarching themes in our report, is equity and inclusion. In other words, better is generally being taken to mean more opportunity to participate for more people. To emerge stronger from this crisis, it's necessary to acknowledge and address the inherent inequalities in sports that often discriminate on the basis of body, gender, sexuality, age, ability, caste, race, tribe, location, class, and religion. So I recognize that time is short today. I'll just provide a summary here of our 6 major recommendations to government and policymakers. One is to prepare for a second wave, which is clearly facing us now. Number 2 is to invest in community sport and sport for development as forms of population health. Number 3, as I talked about a few minutes ago, is to pursue building back better with a focus on redressing inequality. Recommendations 4 and 5 are to involve ministries of sport and public health in both planning and return to play policies. And recommendation 6, which I also spoke to briefly, is to make public space innovations permanent. So here is the link to the complete report, which is published on the Commonwealth website. And the last thing I'll say is that we're also developing right now a version of the report, which is a toolkit for policymakers to hopefully make these recommendations as meaningful and operationable as possible. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.